Every single day, just as the early morning sun began to paint the sky over the historic streets of Savannah, Georgia, Mary Claire was already awake and moving. She was a young woman of only 23 years, possessing long, naturally curly hair in a rich auburn shade that cascaded gracefully almost all the way down to her waist. Her bright eyes carried a rare, profound sweetness, but they also meticulously hid a deep, lingering sadness that very few people in the busy city ever managed to notice. To anyone briefly glancing at Mary Claire as they hurried down the bustling cobblestone sidewalks, she was nothing more than a simple street vendor. She carried a woven basket filled with handmade southern pecan pralines, wearing modest, faded clothes that had clearly been donated by others, and always offering a gentle, timid smile to strangers. She would walk for hours beneath the shade of the massive oak trees, offering the sweet treats she had painstakingly prepared herself, yet absolutely no one could have ever imagined the heartbreaking history that existed behind the quiet grace of that young woman. Mary Claire had been out on these humid streets selling candy since she was merely 8 years old. While the vast majority of children her age were busy playing in parks, receiving beautiful birthday gifts, and being enveloped in the unconditional affection of their parents, she was forced to learn the crushing weight of adult responsibility far too early in her life. She did not grow up in an environment surrounded by warmth or tenderness, but rather entirely the opposite. She had been taken in by an adoptive family who treated her presence as a massive burden, a charity case, and they absolutely never allowed her to forget her precarious place in their home. "You should be on your knees, thanking us for giving you a roof over your head," was a devastating phrase that she was forced to endure hearing almost every single day of her childhood. Her adoptive parents were incredibly cold, rigid and calculating people who provided basic shelter and mere scraps of food, but strictly withheld the one thing Mary Claire desperately yearned for the most. Within the dreary walls of that house, she constantly felt an overwhelming pressure to somehow earn her right to simply exist and breathe their air. While the biological children of the family effortlessly received undivided attention, brand new clothing for every season, and physical affection, Mary Claire was always left in the shadows to collect whatever meager remnants they discarded. She was only ever given a piece of clothing when someone else had completely worn it out and decided they no longer wanted it taking up space in their closet. She was only permitted to sit down at the dining table to eat after every other member of the family had completely finished their meals and walked away. On countless occasions, when there was very little food left in the pots, she would bravely lie and say she simply was not hungry just to avoid igniting yet another explosive, degrading argument. Her adoptive siblings certainly did not make her daily existence any easier, often going out of their way to be cruel. They relentlessly mocked her most secret aspirations, especially a profound dream that Mary Claire had quietly guarded in the deepest corners of her heart since she was a little girl. She desperately wanted to become a fashion model, a dream sparked whenever she passed by the luxurious clothing boutiques downtown. She would stand completely frozen in front of the massive glass windows, staring at the glamorous photographs and silently wondering to herself if a day would ever come when someone might look at her with that kind of admiration. The truly curious tragedy of it all was that Mary Claire authentically possessed a remarkably striking, distinctive natural beauty, yet her harsh environment had completely blinded her to it. Life had systematically beaten her down, forcing her to deeply believe that a poor, discarded girl selling handmade sweets on the streets of Savannah could never possibly step foot into such a glamorous, exclusive world. Consequently, she just kept waking up before dawn, silently preparing her baskets, and stepping out into the unforgiving streets, saving every single dollar she earned as a tiny beacon of hope. On one particular Tuesday morning, Mary Claire woke up in the dark with a strange, inexplicable feeling that something in the universe was shifting around her. She could not quite put the sensation into words. Perhaps it was simply the heavy accumulation of profound exhaustion from spending so many years desperately trying to prove she deserved a tiny space in the world. Nevertheless, she forced herself out of her small cot incredibly early, exactly as she had done for countless mornings before, long before the rest of the hostile household began to stir. She was already standing in the cramped, poorly lit kitchen, carefully melting sugar and mixing pecans for her daily batch of pralines. The rich, comforting aroma of caramelized sugar completely filled the cold house, but entirely unlike a normal, loving home, absolutely no one ever appeared in the doorway to offer a kind compliment. No one ever smiled and asked if the sweets were turning out perfectly, nor did anyone ever bother to ask if her hands were burned or if her spirit was tired. As she meticulously finished wrapping the final pieces in small, delicate squares of parchment paper, she gently placed them inside her worn wicker basket and quietly prepared to slip out the back door. That was precisely the moment she heard the gruff, unapproving voice of her adoptive stepfather echoing harshly right behind her shoulders. He sharply called out her name, forcing her to freeze completely in her tracks, right by the wooden doorframe, her heart sinking in her chest. He looked disdainfully down at her basket of carefully crafted sweets and then glared directly into her tired eyes, speaking with a voice entirely devoid of warmth. "You are 23 years old now. It is high time you start pulling your actual weight and contributing significantly more cash to the expenses of this household." Mary Claire stood in stunned silence, eventually whispering that she already surrendered almost every single dollar she earned from her grueling days on the street. He let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, making it abundantly clear that her immense sacrifices were still viewed as entirely insufficient in his eyes. He cruelly reminded her that life was not built on foolish fantasies, and that they had put food on her table for years, demanding she face reality. Those bitter words sliced straight through her fragile heart like an old, deeply buried blade violently twisting open a very familiar wound, reminding her she was unloved. Desperately fighting to hold back a rising tide of warm tears, she tightly gripped the handle of her heavy basket and stepped out onto the humid, southern pavement. She forced a bright, artificial smile onto her face because she had learned the harsh economic lesson very early on that absolutely no passing tourist ever wanted to buy a piece of candy from a miserable weeping girl. Therefore, despite the immense, suffocating weight pressing down on her chest, she walked down the avenue cheerfully offering her sweets to every single person who walked past her. Some kind-hearted locals and eager tourists happily purchased a few treats, while others rudely brushed past her without so much as a fleeting glance in her direction. But she persistently continued her route. Towards the middle of the morning, she found herself standing near a high-end designer boutique on Broughton Street, a place she often admired from a safe distance. Suddenly, an incredibly elegant, wealthy-looking woman appeared aggressively in the doorway of the shop, sharply motioning with her manicured hand for Mary Claire to come closer. For a few fleeting, incredibly naive seconds, Mary Claire's heart fluttered with a desperate, hopeful thought that perhaps this wealthy woman was going to offer her a proper job or say something wonderfully kind. However, as she approached with a polite greeting, the woman looked her up and down with absolute disgust, angrily demanding to know if she loitered there every day, and viciously ordering her to go sell her trash somewhere else. Overcome with sudden shame, and realizing the woman's husband had been admiring her natural beauty from inside the store, Mary Claire apologized softly, turned her back, and walked away as silent tears finally began to stream down her face, entirely convinced there was absolutely no place for her in this cruel world. For the very first time in a remarkably long period, Mary Claire genuinely entertained the incredibly dark thought of simply giving up on everything and dropping her basket right there on the pavement. Desiring only to escape the humiliating scene, she completely abandoned her usual, profitable route along the busy commercial center and began wandering aimlessly toward the quiet, affluent residential district of Jones Street. She had absolutely no destination in mind. She merely needed to keep her feet moving forward to prevent herself from collapsing completely under the immense weight of her own despair. However, there exists a beautifully mysterious and deeply curious phenomenon regarding the unpredictable trajectory of human life and the precise timing of our destinies. Very often, the exact moment that feels most like a massive, impenetrable door aggressively slamming shut directly in your face is actually the very mechanism forcing you down the exact path you were always meant to travel. Mary Claire was entirely oblivious to this cosmic truth as she blindly navigated a street she actively avoided on any other normal day. On this specific morning, when her entire existence felt like an agonizing failure, she was mere minutes away from colliding with the one human being who would completely alter the trajectory of her future. Wiping the damp, saltiques of mascara from her flushed cheeks, she took a massive, shaking breath of the warm southern air and quietly whispered words of desperate encouragement to her own battered soul. She firmly reminded herself that she had survived significantly worse storms in that dark house, and she courageously forced another bright, professional smile onto her face. She gently lifted her basket once again, and began softly offering her handmade pralines to the few elegantly dressed residents strolling down the quiet, oak-shaded sidewalks. A few moments later, a sleek, incredibly expensive luxury vehicle rolled to a gentle stop right beside the curb where she was standing, the engine humming quietly. Sitting behind the steering wheel was a young, exceptionally well-dressed man named Victor, who possessed an aura of success but lacked the arrogant cruelty Mary Claire was so accustomed to facing. Victor did not look at her with the irritating, condescending pity she usually received, nor did he look through her as if she were a completely invisible ghost haunting the city streets. For several quiet, observant seconds, he simply sat inside his car and intently watched grateful, profoundly polite manner in which she interacted with people, completely mesmerized by her radiant, natural dignity. He took careful note of how she maintained her beautiful, genuine smile even when rude pedestrians aggressively waved her away, and that rare authenticity immediately captured his full attention. He slowly rolled down the tinted passenger window and called out to her with a warm, inviting voice, prompting Mary Claire to quickly step toward the curb and politely offer him a sweet treat. Victor smiled gently, entirely ignoring the candy for a moment, and instead asked her with genuine curiosity if she had meticulously crafted every single item inside that heavy basket by herself. For the very first time that entire grueling day, someone was actually looking past the cheap product to acknowledge the immense human effort and dedication of the young woman holding the basket. She replied proudly that she did everything completely alone, explaining with a shy, embarrassed smile that she had been wandering these streets making and selling candies since she was only 8 years old. That deeply personal revelation visibly moved Victor, because in that exact moment, his experienced eyes realized that behind this striking, naturally gorgeous young woman existed a remarkably complex, heavy story of survival. He generously purchased a large handful of sweets, paying far more than he owed, but before she could walk away, he softly asked her to tell him her actual name. She stared at him in absolute shock, as virtually no one in this massive city ever cared to ask her name, choosing instead to label her merely as the nameless Candy Girl. When she nervously revealed her name, he complimented it warmly, and then proceeded to ask her a profoundly powerful question that no one had asked her in years. "Mary Claire, what is your biggest dream?" After a long, fearful hesitation, she bravely confessed her impossible, foolish desire to be a fashion model, to which Victor firmly and seriously replied that her only real problem was that cruel people had violently manipulated her into believing she possessed no value. Following that deeply unexpected and beautifully profound encounter near the quiet intersection, Mary Claire continued walking her newly discovered route, but something deep inside her chest felt fundamentally different. For the very first time in what felt like a lifetime of endless, invisible suffering, a complete stranger had actually taken a moment to ask about her soul rather than the price of her sugary goods. Victor's penetrating, deeply sincere question completely occupied her thoughts, violently echoing inside her mind during the entire long, exhausting walk back to the gloomy house she was forced to call home. When she finally pushed open the heavy front door later that evening, her worn-out shoes scraping against the floorboards, she was still holding her nearly empty basket, but an undeniable spark of life had been ignited within her eyes. She desperately attempted to slip quietly into the dark kitchen to avoid drawing any attention to herself, but her ever-watchful, deeply suspicious adoptive stepmother immediately intercepted her path. The bitter older woman narrowed her eyes aggressively and demanded to know exactly why Mary Claire was wearing such a ridiculously happy, foolish smirk on her usually tired face. Mary Claire quickly tried to mask her fragile joy, simply whispering that she had experienced a slightly different, slightly better day selling her items on the street. The woman scoffed loudly, clearly deeply annoyed by the presence of happiness. But Mary Claire wisely decided it was infinitely better to keep the miraculous encounter with Victor entirely to herself. She inherently understood that absolutely no one in this dark, oppressive environment would ever comprehend or respect the deeply beautiful, fleeting moment of validation she had just received from a kind stranger. Later that night, in the complete solitude of her freezing, cramped bedroom, Mary Claire stood silently in front of a cracked, discolored mirror leaning against the bare wall. This was the exact same broken mirror where she had spent countless childhood hours silently, pretending to wear glamorous gowns and walking down prestigious, imaginary runways. However, for the very first time in her entire troubled existence, the incredibly toxic thought that her dreams were absolutely impossible did not violently crush her spirit. Instead, she bravely asked her reflection, what if it actually happens? Meanwhile, completely across the sprawling southern city, sitting in a vastly different, luxurious environment, Victor found himself entirely unable to erase the vivid memory of that brief street encounter from his busy mind. He was a highly successful professional who spent his days surrounded by incredibly important, famous, and conventionally beautiful individuals who were absolutely overflowing with limitless opportunities and wealthy connections. Yet, there was something incredibly raw, undeniably authentic, and profoundly captivating about the sweet candy vendor that he had not encountered in the superficial fashion industry for many years. The very next morning, driven by a deep, unshakable intuition, Victor drove his car slowly back down that exact same avenue, scanning every single sidewalk, hoping to spot her tall, graceful silhouette. He searched diligently for several days, driving through different historic districts, looking desperately for the young woman with the long auburn curls and the heavy wicker basket. Finally, after nearly a full week of relentless, determined searching, he spotted her completely surrounded by a large crowd of busy pedestrians, patiently offering her sweet treats exactly as she always did. When Mary Claire noticed the familiar luxury vehicle smoothly pulling up right beside, her heart immediately skipped a massive beat in her chest, and she recognized Victor's warm, welcoming smile instantly. He laughed softly, admitting he honestly feared he might never manage to find her wandering the massive city again, leaving her incredibly shocked to discover he had actually been actively searching for her. He looked deeply into her eyes and confessed that her pure, heartfelt dream had been haunting his thoughts, completely rejecting her nervous apology that her ambition to model was merely a foolish, unattainable fantasy. Victor then revealed an absolutely staggering truth that completely paralyzed Mary Claire right there on the busy southern sidewalk. He worked directly as a high-level scout for one of the most prestigious fashion agencies in the country. He confidently assured her that he knew absolutely for a fact that she possessed exactly the unique, storytelling beauty the industry was desperately searching for, and that he was going to personally arrange a professional audition for her. She walked all the way home that afternoon, feeling like she was floating on air, completely unaware that before she could step into the bright light of her future, she would first have to survive the vicious cruelty of those who wanted her to remain in the dark. That incredibly tense evening, during a painfully quiet, incredibly bleak dinner of overcooked rice and beans, Mary Claire finally gathered every single ounce of courage she possessed in her fragile soul to share her miraculous news. Despite the deeply ingrained, terrifying fear of their inevitable rejection, a tiny, deeply wounded child inside her still desperately hoped to receive just one single solitary word of encouragement from the people who raised her. She took a massive, trembling breath, gripped the edge of the wooden table tightly, and proudly announced that a professional scout had recognized her immense potential and offered her a legitimate modeling audition. For several long, agonizing seconds, an absolute heavy silence fell completely over the grim dining room, but that terrifying quiet was very quickly shattered by explosive, incredibly cruel laughter from every corner of the table. Her adoptive stepmother looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust, violently mocking the very concept of Mary Claire as a model, while her stepfather furiously shook his head and ordered her to stop living in a pathetic fantasy world. Mary Claire desperately attempted to defend herself, pleading that a very successful, highly respected man had genuinely believed in her capabilities. But her stepmother viciously dismissed it as the naive gullibility of a deeply stupid girl. Every single venomous word they spat in her direction felt like a heavy stone violently crushing the fragile, beautiful joy she had been carefully carrying inside her chest all afternoon. She completely abandoned her meager plate of food, abruptly standing up from the table as hot, bitter tears of profound betrayal began cascading violently down her flushed cheeks, and she locked herself tightly inside her small bedroom. Sitting alone on the cold, hard floor beside her pathetic wardrobe containing only torn, oversized garments, she sobbed uncontrollably, terrified that perhaps their vicious, hateful words were actually the true reality of her destiny. However, in the absolute darkest moment of her despair, the warm, steady, incredibly validating voice of Victor suddenly echoed beautifully inside her mind. They made you believe you had no value. For the very first time in her entire life, Mary Claire made the incredibly powerful, rebellious decision to place her unwavering faith in a kind stranger who recognized her boundless potential, rather than the cruel family who only weaponized her limitations. The following morning, exactly as promised, Victor's sleek car arrived directly in front of her dilapidated house, and he stepped out onto the cracked pavement with a massive, highly encouraging smile on his face. Mary Claire hesitated nervously by the open car door, deeply embarrassed by her worn-out sneakers and her faded, oversized sweater, nervously apologizing that she possessed absolutely no glamorous clothing suitable for a professional agency. Victor gently placed a reassuring hand on her trembling shoulder and firmly promised her that the elite directors did not care whatsoever about the cheap fabric on her back. They desperately needed to meet the remarkable woman underneath it. With her heart violently hammering against her ribcage, she slid into the luxurious leather seat, and within 20 minutes they arrived outside a massive, incredibly intimidating glass building that housed the city's premier talent agency. They walked directly into the pristine, brightly lit studio, where Mary Claire was immediately introduced to Eleanor, an incredibly sharp, highly respected veteran director who possessed a legendary reputation for discovering phenomenal, world-class talent. Eleanor immediately asked Mary Claire for her exact height, and when she shyly replied that she stood at 5 feet and 11 inches, the director's strict, evaluating eyes instantly widened with genuine, profound interest. Eleanor instructed her to walk confidently across the expansive, polished wooden floor, and although Mary Claire was utterly terrified and possessed zero formal training, she moved with an undeniably raw, captivating grace that commanded the entire room. At the exact conclusion of that brief, incredibly nerve-wracking audition, Eleanor smiled warmly, a rare occurrence in her demanding profession, and softly told Mary Claire that she truly had absolutely no comprehension of the massive power she held. When Eleanor officially declared that they aggressively wanted to sign her to an exclusive contract immediately, Mary Claire covered her trembling mouth with both hands, sobbing tears of pure, unadulterated joy as the heavy chains of her past finally shattered. After so many grueling years of being treated as entirely invisible, someone incredibly important had finally chosen her, and very soon, incredibly lucrative local campaigns for prestigious southern boutiques began flooding her daily schedule. However, when she joyfully returned to her miserable house to excitedly report that she was officially a working model, the reaction from her deeply toxic family was fundamentally different, completely devoid of any pride or congratulations. Her greedy stepfather immediately calculated the financial implications, coldly declaring that since he was currently unemployed, she was now entirely obligated to surrender the vast majority of her massive new income to fund their lazy lifestyle. In that deeply painful, utterly heartbreaking moment, Mary Claire realized a horrific truth. Toxic people will violently mock the very seeds of your dreams, but they will aggressively demand the absolute largest share of the harvest once you finally bloom. As the remarkably busy weeks turned into incredibly successful months, the entire trajectory of Mary Claire's existence began to transform in ways that felt absolutely magical, yet undeniably earned through her immense hard work. The quiet, deeply insecure young woman who previously spent hours walking the hot pavements selling cheap sugar candies, was now elegantly commanding professional photography sets and fiercely representing massive, highly respected commercial clothing brands. However, Eleanor, the brilliant and deeply observant agency director, very quickly noticed that despite Mary Claire's skyrocketing success, the young model looked incredibly exhausted, carrying a heavy emotional darkness that makeup could never fully conceal. For far too many tragic years, Mary Claire had been violently conditioned to prioritize the selfish needs of absolutely everyone else before herself, eating cold leftovers, wearing discarded rags, and sleeping in an environment that actively destroyed her peace. Therefore, the protective agency made an incredibly firm, executive decision to aggressively intervene in her toxic personal life, formally arranging for her to move into a beautiful, quiet, incredibly safe apartment located in a lovely district of the city. When Eleanor handed over the shiny silver keys, Mary Claire openly wept, stepping into a sanctuary where absolutely no one would ever again scream at her or maliciously declare she was an unwanted, useless burden. By her side through every single terrifying transition was Victor, the incredibly kind, deeply genuine man who had possessed the profound vision to clearly see the magnificent queen hiding gracefully beneath the torn clothes of a street vendor. Over the course of those incredibly transformative months, their beautiful professional friendship organically blossomed into an incredibly deep, profound romance built entirely on mutual, unshakable respect and profound emotional support. Victor had absolutely never fallen in love with the glamorous, heavily stylized fashion model that the rest of the world now so deeply admired. His heart had been entirely captured by the resilient, deeply kind Candy girl on the street. One quiet evening, standing in the middle of her beautiful new living room, he gently took both of her hands in his, looking deeply into her soul, and confessed his immense, overwhelming love for her. He softly declared that he fundamentally refused to only stand beside her when she was victorious and celebrated, but rather he deeply desired to hold her hand tightly while she bravely conquered every single terrifying obstacle life presented. Tears of absolute joy cascaded down her cheeks as she accepted his beautiful, sincere commitment, completely overjoyed to finally possess the genuine, unconditional love she had desperately craved since she was an 8-year-old child. As a few more highly successful years passed, Mary Claire continued to dominate her demanding industry, wisely learning the complex mechanics of corporate business and aggressively building an incredibly secure, magnificent life she once deemed entirely impossible. Yet, the most remarkably beautiful trait that constantly astounded absolutely everyone who crossed paths with Mary Claire was the profound, heavily guarded purity of her incredibly forgiving, profoundly human heart. Despite all the monumental wealth and massive social status she had accumulated, she absolutely never forgot the incredibly dark, painful house that had reluctantly sheltered her, nor the exceptionally cruel people who raised her. One bright, remarkably clear Sunday afternoon, Mary Claire made the incredibly heavy, deeply emotional decision to drive her beautiful car back to that terrible house for one final, definitive visit to completely close the darkest chapter of her life. When she gracefully stepped through the peeling wooden door, wearing a stunning designer coat and radiating absolute peace, her adoptive parents and siblings simply stared at her in incredibly stunned, entirely speechless shock. She had absolutely not returned to scream at them, nor had she arrived to arrogantly flaunt her massive wealth. She simply looked them directly in the eyes and calmly announced that she had officially come to forgive them entirely. She bravely acknowledged that while they entirely failed to love her in the way a vulnerable, broken child so desperately needed, they had indeed provided a physical roof over her head, and for that basic provision she was genuinely grateful. She firmly informed them that she had formally arranged for a strict, incredibly generous monthly financial allowance to be deposited into their accounts so they would never starve, but absolutely nothing more would ever be given. To her complete lack of surprise, they did not appear genuinely happy or thankful for the massive financial rescue, because it was absolutely never just the money they truly cared about. They deeply missed their cruel, absolute control over her. They furiously realized that the broken, terrified little girl who silently accepted Their vicious emotional abuse was permanently gone, entirely replaced by a phenomenal, unshakable woman who completely owned her incredible power. Stepping out into the warm southern breeze, Mary Claire realized a profound truth about the complex, often painful journey of human life. As we grow older and inevitably collect deep, heavy scars from the very people who were supposed to protect us, we eventually learn that true family is absolutely never defined simply by blood or by those who merely unlock a door to let us sleep in their hallway. Real family is powerfully built by those who intentionally create incredibly safe, beautiful spaces for our souls to expand, those who clearly recognize our hidden brilliance when we are entirely consumed by the terrifying shadows of our own doubts. Sometimes, the absolute lack of love that severely threatens to break us becomes the very fierce, undeniable wind that ultimately teaches our fragile wings exactly how to fly. We must never forget the harsh, difficult roads that fundamentally shaped our deep resilience, nor should we ignore those who offered us a basic plate of food during our darkest times. However, we are absolutely never obligated to remain permanently seated at a toxic table where we are cruelly forced to eat entirely alone in silence. By bravely choosing radical forgiveness over heavy bitterness, we permanently sever the agonizing chains of our past, firmly protecting our profound peace. We step forward embracing only those who truly cherish our hearts, completely ensuring our brilliant light can absolutely never be extinguished by another person's darkness again.